To some people, this is just another ordinary goal being kicked by another ordinary AFL first gamer. But little did we know that this was the proverbial passing of the baton. The baton being the weight of expectation and hope for all of Collingwood's future aspirations, and the two runners being Buckley, the one who did all he could in his career to bring the success that eluded us during the 2000s, and the runner taking the baton being Scott Pendlebury, the one who was about to commence on a special journey. Very special.
Winner of the North Smith Medal for 2010 is Scott Pendlebury from Collingwood.
To first know who Pendles is, I must bring your attention to the fact that he has a strong basketball background. Just kidding, I'll leave that to the commentators to incessantly bring that up every time there is a narrative about Pendles during a Pies game. However, what I will mention is that Pendles initially accepted a slot at the AIS in Canberra, but within just 3 weeks he opted out of the slot and actually afforded an opportunistic scenario for someone named Paddy Mills to fill the vacancy left by Pendlebury. 20 odd years later, Paddy Mills is now an Australian basketball household name and will be forever etched into the history of the San Antonio Spurs, winning the championship in 2014. Thanks, Scott Pendlebury. You do more than just what we see on the footy field. What can't this man do? Talk about a butterfly effect. Pendle's reasoning to dropping out of the scholarship was to pursue a shot with the Gippsland Power in their TAC Cup, less than 30 minutes away from his local residence in Sale. Pendles was identified in a TAC with his innate ability to pinpoint passes that suggested his IQ was levels ahead of anyone around his age at the time. Collingwood was actually made aware to this potential that Pendles held by the Gippsland Power manager, Peter Francis, an accomplished ex-AFL footballer who amassed 150 games throughout the 1980s. In Scotty's year with the Gippsland Power, he played 19 games, averaged 22 possessions per game and kicked 11 goals with an old mate in Dale Thomas. After an ultra-competitive stint at the peak of the AFL, Collingwood came to a freefall in 2004 and 2005, finishing 13th and 17th respectively. Back then, if you won less than 5 games in a year, you were compensated with a priority pick, which ultimately landed both Daisy at pick 2 and Pendles at pick 5. To say there was a series of backlash from the general AFL world would be an understatement, especially considering the fact that the Pies had just come off the back of 2 grand final appearances against arguably the greatest dynasty team to ever grace the AFL field. The other point that also dampened the year for the Pies was the fact that they were riddled by an extensive injury list with Nathan Buckley, Leon Davis, Ryan Loney, Didak, Rocker, Fraser, all playing less than 12 games each that year, suggesting it wasn't all doom and gloom for the Pies in that moment. In 2006, Scotty's introduction to the AFL was not an instant hit like it was for someone like Nick Dacos in recent years. It was due to a number of variables, one being that Pendles was hit by a bout of glandular fever in the pre-season. By round 10, Scotty was fully recovered and primed to make his debut against Brisbane, who had had the wood over us in those early 2000s. As we know it, Bucks handed Pendles his first goal with his first kick, and maybe a dash of Bucks' elite field kicking was also injected into him by way of that memorable sequence. Pendles finished with 13 disposals and then later in the year had a breakout game against Fremantle in round 15, collecting 23 disposals, a season-high 14 contested possessions, and 1 goal to top it all off. While that positive performance did further solidify his spot in the AFL team for the games that followed, he was unable to build on that form, collecting 4 disposals, 14 and 15 in the next 3 games, which led to his omission going into the elimination final against the Doggies, where we ended up losing by 41 points, quite comprehensively. In 2007, SP10 changed his jersey number from 16 to number 10, a now very marketable signature number that is donned by many aspiring young footy players today. With the natural growth in Pendle's game, along with a handful of Collingwood players entering the twilight of their own careers, namely your Nathan Buckleys, who only managed to play 5 games in 2007, Paul Lakiria, 11 games in his final year, it was time for Pendles to embark on his steep upwards trajectory in 2007 as a mainstay in that Collingwood midfield. Pendles was duly rewarded, being picked as a Rising Star nominee for round 4 where he played a game against Port Adelaide, collecting 20 disposals and 2 goals. Essentially an early stamp in his breakout year as a budding star in the AFL. Collingwood ended a winning season and found themselves coming up against West Coast in a semi-final which turned out to be an all-time classic. The Pies, down by 23 points midway through the third term, Pies were able to claw back to take it to extra time, where Pendlebury kicked a vital goal that helped Pies edge West Coast, winning by 19 points in the end. Pendlebury collected 26 disposals, that crucial goal in extra time, and a season-high 7 clearances. Scotty's impact was culled on an individual level in the Premier League final, collecting 13 disposals for the game. The Pies fall excruciatingly short by 5 points. Cats go on to win the flag. Gut-wrenching. SP10 finished the season averaging 18 disposals per game, nearly averaging a goal a game, and most importantly stringing together the full 23 games. To tip off his promising season, he finished second in the Rising Star tally behind only one certain Joel Selwood, a rivalry that was just within its infancy, and second placed in Collingwood's Copeland Trophy, just behind Big Trav. A huge feather in Pendle's cap to be recognised by his peers in just his second year. In the 2008 pre-season, Pendles was elevated to the 5-man leadership group as deputy vice-captain at the ripe age of 21. Pendles enjoyed an outstanding performance in the annual Anzac Day clash against Essendon, where the Pies ended up winning by 70-odd points, collecting 33 disposals, 7 tackles, 7 clearances, and 3 goal assists. And if it weren't for Paul Medhurst kicking 6 goals, Pendles may have earned his first Anzac Day medal at 21. Another massive game that took the league by total shock was the round 9 clash where the Pies beat Geelong by 86 points, which ended up being the only loss in the home and away season for Geelong. Pendles, of course, played his role, collecting 26 disposals and 1 goal for his troubles. Pendles was awarded with his first BOG performance in the context of the Brownlow in round 21 against a top 4 suitor, the Sydney Swans. SB10 filled the stat sheet with 28 disposals, 1 goal, 10 contested possessions and a goal assist, which would warrant the first full 3 votes for Pendlebury in his career when it comes to the Brownlow, the first of many best on ground performances to follow, of course. Scotty and the Pies would finish the season strong and earn a spot in the final series for the 3rd year in a row. These finals appearances were a key pillar in fast-tracking the development of the young Collingwood side. Unfortunately, the Pies would bow out in the semi-final against St Kilda. Despite the loss, Pendles would be able to walk out of the final series with his head held high, averaging 23 disposals in the 2 finals games, and providing 2 goal assists in the losing final against St Kilda. It was fair to say his accolades were quickly building, and after another impressive year for the young leader, Pendles was awarded with being elected in the Victorian squad for the AFL Hall of Fame tribute match, where he collected 19 disposals in 1 half of footy. Pendles recalls the game being one of the highest quality of games he had ever been a part of at that time. Also, Pendles would feature on the top 3 podium once again in the Collingwood B&F count, this time placing 3rd for the Copeland Trophy. 2009 would mark another significant step up in the Pendles' rapid emergency as a premier midfielder in the AFL, but it would be remiss of me if I wasn't to mention the new draftees who would join the party. 1, Steele Sidebottom, and 2, Dane Beams, taken at pick 11 and pick 29 respectively. What a draft night this turned out to be for Collingwood. Scotty had a career high 35 disposals in a victory against the Brisbane Lions. He had also collected a season high 16 contested possessions, which would all but confirm that he would receive the Brownlow votes at season's end. What was to follow in the Anzac Day game, just the week after what was another incredible feat for SB10, he collects 30 disposals and had his highest rated game for the year, finishing off with 170 ranking points. However, if your team loses a clash, we know typically it is unlikely that you will leave the ground with the medal dangling around your neck. Paddy Ryder ends up taking the medal for 2009. Pendles agonisingly close 2 years in the running. Maybe a 3rd time lucky in 2010? Let's get back to that soon. From round 9 onwards, the Pies run rampant on a 13-game run where they would lose only 2 games during that period. Scotty, a massive cog in a wheel throughout. During the run, he collected 38 disposals against West Coast in round 9. In round 11, 39 disposals and a goal on a massive Queen's Birthday clash against Melbourne, and another big game, accruing 36 disposals and 1 goal against Brisbane, a team who he had taken a liking to that season, collecting maximum Brownlow votes for both those games against the Lions. Come season's end, the Pies would manage to finish in the top 4 thanks to their strong finish to the end of the year, which would set a Clash of the Titans contest in a qualifying final against St Kilda. However, in heartbreaking circumstances, Pendles would endure a broken fibula in a front and centre contest with Lee Montagna. At first, Scotty had thought it was a cork, however after another crack on the field, Pendles recalls hearing another snap, which had pointed towards the fact that he had broken his leg. 2 hours later, he finds himself in a theatre for surgery to put a plate in the broken leg. You would think Pendles' season would be all but over this late into the year, but Pendles did have other plans. He went through a fitness test leading up to the game against Geelong, and he managed to get through the 2 big sessions on Wednesday and Friday. However, the final hurdle was a box jump where Mick Malthouse wanted to see if he could absorb the landing pressure on his once broken leg. And that was unfortunately the failed test that ruled out Pendles for the prelim date with Geelong. And yes, once again, the Pies would fall short to the Cats in a prelim. This time a far cry compared to the prelim contest in 2007, a 73-point loss. Despite the abrupt end to Pendles' massive year, he would still be acknowledged by his fellow peers, being shortlisted for the All-Australian squad, and additionally Pendles was the highest polled Pies player in the 2009 Brownlow tally, collecting 13 votes. He ends up averaging 26 disposals per game, 4.5 clearances, 9 contested possessions, all career highs at the time. 2009 would also mark as a tick for the Pies, with Dane Beams and Steele Sidebottom featuring prominently in their first year at AFL level. Now the pessimists would consider these years as a fail mark for the Pies leading into the 2010s. However, for me, being an optimist, I had a feeling these positive seasons were just a prelude for what was to come just around the corner. In round 3, Pendles would revisit the player and the team that inevitably put a full stop to his season in 2009, St Kilda and Lee Montagna. There was no justice for Pendles as he only managed to collect 16 disposals and would end up being his lowest rated game for the entire season. The Saints, they end up winning 41-69, and we all need to keep a tab on this matchup, for it might not be the last time they face this season. Pendles was quick to respond on a personal note a couple games later in the Anzac Day clash against Essendon, amassing 29 disposals, 1 goal, and it was finally enough to seal his first Anzac Day medal after knocking on the doors of the selection panel. It wasn't until round 9 that Pendles and the Pies would have to run into another inroad, this time against another premiership fancy as usual, Geelong, a team who had consistently haunted us in the preceding years. He would finish the game with just 18 disposals and losing by 36 points. 2 of the biggest tests in the first half of the season beaten comprehensively. Shortly after, the Pies would go on an 11-game unbeaten streak before losing a dead rubber game in the final fixture of the home and away season. In one of the first big milestones in Scott Pendlebury's career, Game 100, he is tasked with a demon to slay, Geelong in the preliminary final. The story is there to be written. Pendles leads the way and avenges the recent final losses against the Cats, collecting 24 disposals and kicking 2 goals to put an end to a miserable night for the Cats, going down by 41 points. Finally, in the big dance, it was the Pies versus Saints, another team that gave us trouble in the final series in 2009. Pendles would relish the opportunity to right the wrongs of the injustices he endured when he sustained the season-ending broken leg. Yep. It was a draw, and fortunately for the Pies, we would be granted another rendezvous with the Saints after having limited impact in the first grand final. Pendles only had 19 disposals, with 14 of them being handballs, a divergence from his typical 1-to-1 kick-to-handball ratio that he has maintained over the course of his illustrious career. Never mind, Take 2 would supervene and further sweeten the story of 2010 for Pendles. The Pies come booming out of the gates, kicking 6 goals to 1 in the first half, and run away with it in the third quarter. Pies, premiers, winning by 56 points. Pendles, vengeance. Finally, collecting 29 disposals, 6 clearances, and 11 tackles, his highest tackle count for the year. The cherry on top? Well, that's the Norm Smith medal in game 102 at the ripe age of 22. SB10's luminous year was credited furthermore by way of being named in the AA team for the first time, while also polling 21 Brownlow votes, finishing in 4th position. 2011 would stamp another incredible breakthrough in Pendles' continued development at AFL level, entering arguably the hottest run of games performance-wise in his young career. He would help the Pies to a 6-game unbeaten to begin the 2011 season, with no premiership hangover in sight. Pendles averaged 29 disposals and nearly a goal a game and a goal assist a game. This stunning run culminated in a back-to-back Anzac Day medal being honoured to Pendles. 34 disposals and 3 goals in a 30-point win, leaving him just 1 medal away from Hurd's 3 Anzac Day medals. A blockbuster clash would follow in round 8 against the Cats, a rivalry that would already forever be etched into legendary of both clubs, and yet there was still more to come. The Cats in the last quarter would overcome their demise in front of the goals that night, winning by 3 points, with 17 behinds attached to the 8 goals they kicked. Scotty was valiant in effort, collecting 20 disposals and kicked a goal as well. Surprisingly, the Pies wouldn't lose another game until round 24, and who would have thought it was Geelong? This time at dead rubber as far as the premiership table is concerned, with the Pies having top spot sealed, but admittedly, it mattered in the world of psychology, given the likelihood of meeting Geelong in the final series shortly after. Anyways, the Pies lost by 96 points in front of 85,000 at the G. A recurring silver lining when Collingwood don't win, Pendle's performing well. An emphatic performance, 30 disposals and a goal, and the fact that the game didn't really matter. He would help carry the Pies to a consecutive grand final appearance, beating West Coast with 38 disposals, 17 contested possessions, and then the Hawks in an all-time classic while collecting 32 disposals. 3 behinds he kicked ended up being the final margin in Collingwood's favour. Who said behinds were useless? Once again, the Pies have to address the boogeyman under their bed, Geelong. Pendles was massive, collecting 33 disposals, 10 clearances, 15 contested possessions. Sadly, it wasn't enough. Hawkins and co. steal the premiership cake this time around. Despite the heartbreak in 2011, it was still a premier year for SB10, winning his first BNF for the club and the best finals player trophy. A second year running in the All-Australian, and in the Brownlow, Pendles polled 24 Brownlow votes, a current career high, finishing equal third behind his mate Dane Swan, who had his career high in Brownlow votes, 34. At that point, the most votes since the introduction of the 3-2-1 system. It was however later broken in 2017 and 2021, where Dusty and Ollie Wines both had 36 votes in their respective years. In retrospect, Pendles believes that they enjoyed the 2010 flag for a little bit longer than they probably should have. Moving into 2012, the Pies continued to remain as a top echelon team in the league during the early coaching tenure of Nathan Buckley, who had taken over beginning after the heartbreaking 2011 grand final loss from Mick Malthouse. Pendles did gain some sort of retribution in round 8, collecting 30 disposals and a career high 4 goals. It was of course a bittersweet return, considering it could never outweigh the flag that was missed, further deterred by the point that the Cats didn't even finish top 4 in 2012, being a lesser team compared to the previous year. While Pendles was plausible in the back end of 2012, despite overcoming another crack to his leg which forced him to miss 6 games, the Pies as a whole stumbled across the finish line of the regular season, finishing with a 4-4 win-loss record going into the clash against the Hawks, who had beaten the Pies both times in the regular season, and no surprise, the Hawks would beat the Pies comprehensively in the qualifying final. Pendles, being his usual self, standing tall, collected 30 disposals and another 10 clearances. Pendles would follow suit the next week against West Coast and collect 30 disposals and a goal in a thrilling 13-point win. The Pies were shown the doors at the SCG, being well beaten by eventual premiers, the Sydney Swans. Although Scotty could once again walk out chest tall in conclusion of 2012, finishing with another 30 disposals, 10 contested possessions and 2 goal assists. It must be said, the year was dampened and severely hindered by the tragic loss of John McCarthy, former Collingwood player. We'll never truly know to what extent it had an impact on the lads in that 2012 final series. A second placed finish in the Copeland Trophy behind Dane Beams 3 years in a row, being a part of the All-Australian team, another 15 Brownlow votes. Just an ordinary season for Pendles at that point. 2013 was indeed a disappointing season for the Pies as a whole, considering the list had been built up to, at that time, an average age of 25.2, which is usually a sign that teams are or should be entering their strongest years as a team. It seemed even more likely that 2013 could be the Pies' year, with the young squad simultaneously being the 5th most experienced team on a games tally. And with all that being factored in, an elimination final loss is all the boys could scrounge up that season. But this is a Scott Pendlebury documentary, and we couldn't possibly skim through these lighter years from a club standpoint, because what Pendles was able to achieve over the following years is what sets the final stages for where we are today in 2024. For the Supercoach lovers, Pendles had his highest performing year, averaging 125.5 ranking points for the season, only second behind someone who plays much like his prodigy Nick Dacos, Gary Ablett. He averaged 128.9 ranking points for the year, mostly thanks to his innate ability to hit the scoreboard so much more than his midfield opposition. Pendles started the year on fire, collecting 30 disposals, with 18 of them being contested, steering the Pies to a comfortable win against North Melbourne. In the end, the momentum would roll into Scotty's 150th game against the Pies' greatest rivals, Carlton. a team that was very much so a finals fancy around those times. The Pies were down by 10 points at the final break, however the lads weathered through for their future leader and ended up winning by 17 points, with Pendles kicking the final goal of the game to add the cherry to the top of his standout game, being 23 disposals, 2 goals, and 2 Brownlow votes to go with his efficient performance, a word that will forever be intertwined with SB10. Efficient. Fast tracking to round 16 in game 163, Pendles would gather his career high in disposals, 42 of them against the Crows, which still stands today as his highest accumulation. Additionally noted, Pendles loves playing against the Crows on a personal note. He averages 27.71 disposals per game against them, the highest average he has had against any team. Pendles would put the proverbial foot to the Adelaide Crows' neck in that game, kicking 2 goals late in the fourth quarter to solidify the victory. Obviously, the 3 Brownlow votes would accompany this all-time performance. And ironically, in the most important game of the year, Pendles did end up having one of his lowest rated games for the season against Port Adelaide in the elimination final. I do say this with a grain of salt, as a 24 disposal, 12 contested possession, 7 clearance game isn't a quiet one, but for Mr. Perfect, it might have not been enough for his own lofty standards. A disappointing home final loss to further send the Pies into a spiral away from what was once guaranteed as a dynasty team, set up by one of our greatest predecessors, Mick Malthouse. But the heir apparent, Bucks, was evidently struggling in the hot seat. The accolades for Pendlebury continued to pile on at the end of 2013, being deemed the AFL-CA Champion Player of the Year, collecting the most coaches' votes over the course of the year. He would also win his second Copeland Trophy ahead of Dane Swan, who had a crazy year within his own right in 2013. A quiet 21 Brownlow votes, finishing in 5th place, 2 spots behind the 3rd place Dane Swan, and the last award, but certainly not the least, a 4th claim to an AA spot as the wingman in the team. 2014 would mark a new era for Pendles, appointed as a new skipper to take Collingwood forward. It seems as though 2010 Premiership captain Nick Maxwell was ready to hand it over to someone as ready as Scott Pendlebury. Maxwell will forever be etched in the history of Collingwood's glory, leading the Pies as the skipper in their 2010 Premiership season. Pendles led from the front in 2014 by way of his leadership and his performances on the field. Not far behind him were players like Dane Beams, Steele Sidebottom and Dane Swan. However, beyond that, 2014 would mark as another disappointing season for the Pies as a whole, missing out on finals thanks to a 3-8 record in the final 11 games. 3 wins, 8 losses. Scotty's best game of the year and arguably one of his best in his long career was against the Swans in round 2. A team that would make it all the way to the grand final that year against eventual premiers Hawthorn. It was a game that Pendles literally did it all. At the conclusion of 2014, Pendles was awarded his 5th consecutive honours in the All-Australian team, and a 3rd Copeland Trophy would also follow suit in 2014, a 2nd earning in a row for Pendles. 2015 was once again an overall disappointing year for Collingwood as a whole, however Pendlebury was incredible on his own grounds. Pendles would also enjoy an incredible milestone game in his 200th game of his career. Pendles would lead the way, business as usual for him despite the massive achievement of his own. He collected 35 disposals, kicked 3 goals, and had a career high 4 goal assists, and yes, 3 Brownlow votes was the final polish to a stellar performance in a dominant win over the Gold Coast Suns. The only dour note, his 200th was played in front of a small crowd, 16,000 in Queensland. It probably comes without any surprise, but at least worth highlighting, Pendles has his best winning percentage against the Suns, being 11 wins and 3 losses. Leading up to the bye, the Pies were flying, sitting in the top 4, but before we knew it for what it is today, the Pies were surmounted by the bye curse. The Pies would go on to win 2 games for the rest of the year, missing out on finals once again. It must be said that in retrospect, those years were far from failure for the clubs in its entirety, given the club was going through a hopeful, quick rebuild. Being the 4th youngest club in 2015, some of those young players that attributed to that average included players like Darcy Moore, Braden Maynard and Jordan De Goey, fresh out of that successful 2014 draft. Pendles went on to win his 3rd consecutive Copeland Trophy, his 4th overall, and slowly creeping up to one of the Collingwood greats, Nathan Buckley, who sits atop with his own 6 Copeland Trophies. A little subplot here when it comes to the context of his footy career, but definitely not that when it comes to his life outside of footy. In the month of October in that year, Pendles decides to marry his wife, Alex Davis, where they share a very special relationship and still uphold that to this day. 2016 would stamp another year of development for the group as a whole. The Pies weren't really able to string together a run of games that would suggest the Pies were capable of making the 8 that year. The one shock game that springs to mind from 2016 is the game between Collingwood and Geelong in round 9, where the Cats were flying, sitting 7-1 and 2nd on the ladder, Meanwhile, the Pies were 3 and 5 leading into this clash. Pendles was bullish on getting the Pies back on track in 2016, tearing the game to shreds, collecting 26 disposals, 3 goals, and 2 goal assists. The win would eventually be sealed by a margin of 24 points thanks to a 47-3 first quarter which left Geelong goalless. Come season's end, the Pies finished in 12th position with a losing record of 9 wins and 13 losses, our worst record in years. It must be mentioned that 2016 would also mark the retirement of Dane Swan after sustaining a serious leg injury in the first round against the Swans. It would be an understatement to suggest that Pendles missed one of his partners in crime just a little bit in 2016. The question would be now is who fills that void and who wants to step up as Pendles' dance partner in the midfield. By the way, Pendles earned his 5th Copeland Trophy, his 4th in consecutive years. Pendles rolled into round 1 2017 putting his absolute best foot forward, which is his left for those that may not know. It was a game against the reigning premiers, the Doggies, a side who the Pies had traded Travis Cloke to after disappointing in 2016, only playing 13 games and kicking 17 goals, while also being dropped 3 times. So as you could imagine, this was a soap opera in the making for everyone to tune into on the first game of Friday Night Footy for the season. Pendles showed absolutely no sympathy for his premiership teammate having his best game for the year in round 1, collecting 35 disposals and 24 of them being contested, a career high to this day, and 2 goals in the 4th quarter to try and reel Collingwood into a comeback win. Unfortunately, round 1 would mark as a loss for the Pies, losing by 4 goals. And yes, Cloke somewhat got his payback by way of a goal, and yes, it did kind of hurt my soul as a young Collingwood diehard that used to adore Big Trav, and still kind of does. In the month of May, Pendlebury and Alex would welcome their first-born child, Jax, and for the Collingwood tragic, Jax will be available as a father-son selection in the 2035 National Draft. Yes, Pendlebury did play the week of Jax's birth, as Jax was introduced on a Tuesday. Unsurprisingly, the perhaps sleep-deprived Scott Pendlebury had one of his worst games for the year against GWS in Sydney, losing by 3 points. He ended up collecting 20 disposals and 70 Supercoach points, a far cry from his average of 107 for that year. Ironically, Scotty's biggest personal footy occasion to this point of his career would have to be his 250th versus the Hawks in round 15. It would also unfortunately mark another game where Scotty would lower his standards, collecting 21 disposals, his second lowest disposal count for the year. The Hawks ran away with the game in the 4th quarter, kicking 6 goals to 2, winning the match by 24 points. Now, I am reluctant to bring this up, but it is time. Scotty's worst win-loss record against any club in his career is the Hawks, who owned us for a large part of the 2010s. Scotty's record as of the present year in 2024 is 8 wins and 16 losses, which is a 30% winning record. Also, Pendles only has 6 Brownlow votes against the Hawks, which is also his least against any club. Yes, despite the fact Pendles has played Hawthorn 26 times, which is the 6th most games against any club, he still only has 6 Brownlow votes to his name against the Hawks. Unfortunately, Pendles' season would come to a premature end after round 17, sustaining a broken finger, ending the year playing 16 games, his least amount in his career barring the 2020 COVID season. The durability should not be undermined of this man. Pendlebury then enters year 12 at the age of 31, experiencing a gradual decline in output as far as the stats are concerned. Could this man be seen caught for holding a ball in his drop-off? Nope, not yet. Was he losing his ability to mirage his opposition in crowded contest? Definitely not. What about the impeccable vision with his left foot? Still there. How about Pendles' eye for being able to lace up a bird with his bouncing skills that would surely stem from his basketball background? On that note, let's skim all the way through to that exact game. Round 18 versus North Melbourne 2018. 30 disposals, 1 goal, 3 Brownlow votes, and 1 bird bounced on. And the Pies have finally found their way back into flag hopes for the first time in many years. I just want to quickly add that in 2018, Pendles set his own career record for the most consecutive games where he kicked a goal, being 8 games in a row from round 6 to round 15. The very next game, Pendles goes on a tear against Richmond, collecting 37 disposals, 13 clearances, which is an equal career high, but unfortunately it was a game that fell away for the Pies in the end. But Pendlebury was adamant on leaving a note for the Tigers, as we were all sure we would see them again in 2018. However, unfortunately, Pendles would have his poorest game against the eventual premiers, West Coast. 17 disposals and 1 clearance in the qualifying final, and then just the 20 touches in the biggest game of the year, where the Pies would fail to beat West Coast in all 3 meetings in 2018. 2019 was a year that Pendlebury would wind back the clock a handful of years to prove the critics that, similar to wine, he can get better with age. In round 6 versus Essendon, the annual Anzac Day clash between the two sides, Pendles would collect the ball for fun, accruing 38 disposals for the game, 16 contested possessions, which would steer the Pies to a thrilling win. Sure enough, he would earn his third Anzac Day medal, tying the record with Essendon legend James Hird. Surely, all parties involved could appreciate this special moment in the history of the Anzac Day meeting, right?
Shame on anyone that booed a champion.
Look, it's a damn shame, but tensions were high as the Bombers fans felt they were perhaps robbed by the umps at certain points during that fourth quarter. I understand. Pendles once again lead the Pies to a top 4 finish, dreaming of breaking the 9-year premiership drought, winning it back in 2010, just 4 years into his young career back then. And what better motivation could you ask for going into his qualifying final, being just the third Collingwood player to reach the 300-game milestone? It was a classy 24 touches, 1 goal and 9 tackles that would help send Collingwood into the preliminary final against GWS. My stomach still hurts thinking about this. Pendle's second game with 20 disposals or less in his last 2 win or go home finals. I feel sick recalling this season. Let's move on very quickly. In retrospect, Pendle's had a resurgent year, being recalled to the AA side for the first time since 2014, an amazing feat at age 32. And outside of footy, Scott and Alex would welcome their second child to the world, Darcy. Keep them coming, Pendles. The more the Pendles running around, the better for the prolonged success in Collingwood's future history books. We love it. Surely 2020 could only mean things would get better for the Pies after 2 tantalising close seasons to achieving the ultimate goal. The Pies would be forced to wait 4 months between round 1 and round 2, and gee, couldn't you tell Pendles must have been losing his mind at home, dreaming of a return to the G. In the return game against the Tigers, he would collect 32 disposals, 12 contested possessions and 3 Brownlow votes in a game that ended in a draw. The feeling that ensued following that final siren was probably a perfect indication of how everyone felt while the world had stopped, somber and confused. In round 20 against Port Adelaide at the Gabba, Pendles would take over as the most capped player for Collingwood in its entire AFL-VFL history, surpassing Tony Shaw, a Collingwood legend whose career spanned over the course of 16 years, collecting a bunch of individual honours. But of course, none greater than the team honour in 1990, winning the flag against Essendon, collecting 32 disposals and earning the Norm Smith for his troubles. The 2020 season was actually sombre and confusing for SB10 and the Pies also, falling out of the top 4 and smashed against the Cats in a semi-final where it only collected 14 disposals. 2021 was another total disaster for the Pies, finishing second last on the ladder, which would equate to Pendle's lowest record wins in a season, collecting just 5 wins. Thankfully, despite the pain that the Pies had to endure in 2021, a quick rebound was imminent, with Scott's heir apparent gracing the field in 2022, Nick Dacos. It was a year where Pendlebury's role in the team would truly shift more over to a nurturing position, at least now, more than ever, rather than Pendles being our go-to all the time. Fast-tracking to round 18 against Adelaide, it only just so happened to be Pendles' 350th game milestone. So how did the weathered skipper go in his 350th? Well, just a quiet 29 disposals, 12 tackles, 11 contested possessions and 1 goal to help drag the Pies over the finish line with a massive win. And how did the protege go? Given we dubbed Pendles as more of a nurturer in 22, his protege Nick Dacos, 40 disposals, 3 goals and 3 Brownlow votes. Wow. In a complete dream run season in Craig McRae's first year as head coach for the Pies, winning far too many close games than our hearts would have liked, the Pies ultimately fell 1 step short of completing this miracle season, losing to Sydney in the preliminary final by a solitary point. Pendlebury would tip his cap, collecting 29 touches, an equal team high for the game, proving at the time that he still has what it takes to perform in the biggest of games. At the end of 2022, Pendles would pass the baton to Darcy Moore, taking over as a skipper for the club. No pressure, Darce. And at the age of 35 in 2023, Scott Pendlebury would continue to excel as a mainstay in the star-studded Collingwood midfield, steering the Pies to an incredible 11-2 run into the midway bye. In round 17 against the Bulldogs, Pendles would take over as the all-time leading disposal getter in AFL history. Rolling into that qualifying final against the D's, Pendles was largely unsighted, but it seems he may have had greater plans on an individual level for the following games after that narrow win against the D's. And in game 382, Scotty was the 4th highest rated player on the field in the preliminary final against GWS, collecting 25 of his own, 9 contested possessions and an unusual 3 intercept marks. His performance, along with the brute assertion by De Goey, was just enough to see Collingwood set an almighty battle with the Lions at the G as the final dance. We'd expect nothing less. It did end up being a back and forth affair all day long, and the Pies needed a hero late in the third as the Lions had kicked 2 goals unanswered to see them in front by a couple points. While on the other hand, the Pies had also kicked 0 goals, 6 behinds in that third quarter. But that was only until Mr. Pendlebury found himself in a small pocket in the 50 where Bobby Hill would set Pendles up for a relatively simple set shot. What would follow in this fourth quarter would mark as one of the greatest grand finals in all of AFL's time. And there we have it. Pendles pounces on the elusive second premiership that has troubled him for 13 years, the longest drought for a player between 2 premierships, along with his old buddy Rusty. Another accolade in the game which probably just serves as a side piece when it comes to levels of importance from that game, but nevertheless worth noting, Pendles had levelled as equal 6th most games played in the history of the AFL, tying with Robert Harvey at 383 games. Not out, of course, for Pendles as it stands, as he dares to go one more in 2024, where we see Pendles hopefully reach the 400 game milestone against Carlton, which is set to come upon us within the next couple weeks. Go Pies.